The smell of river ice and her own blood had become the same thing somewhere around the 2nd mile, and Tavi had stopped trying to tell them apart. Her boots had split at the seams half a kilometre back, the leather too old and too thin for the rocks beneath the frozen creek bed, and now she was walking on what felt like raw bone. The boy strapped to her chest with a dish towel and a length of kitchen twine had gone quiet 4 minutes ago, and that quiet was a sound she would hear for the rest of her life if she let it become permanent. She pressed her palm against his back. The faintest rise, a soap bubble holding its shape against wind. Still breathing, she kept moving. The creek bed ran south from Greymarch territory into the Ironmoor highlands, and every wolf in 3 provinces knew that the Ironmoor border was not something you crossed and walked away from. The stories said Beckett Ironmoor had strung trespassers from the gate posts. The stories said his wolf was black as forge iron and twice the size of any natural animal, and that he had torn his own uncle apart at 17 to stop a coup. The stories said a lot of things. Tavi did not care about any of them, because Noah was 5 weeks old and he had been swallowing poison for 9 days before she'd figured out what was in the milk. 9 days. She'd replayed it over and over during the walk. The way the bottles had smelled slightly off. A bitterness beneath the formula that she'd assumed was the herbal supplement the pack physician had prescribed. She was a kitchen girl. She scrubbed pots and gutted fish and mopped grease from stone floors. She was not supposed to be anywhere near the nursery, but the nursery shared a wall with the scullery, and for 5 weeks she had listened through that wall to a baby crying in a way that didn't sound like hunger. It sounded like pain. On the 9th day, she had taken one of the bottles from the warmer while the nursery attendant was on a smoke break and held it under the light. The liquid was cloudy, not formula cloudy, wrong cloudy. She'd dipped her finger in and tasted it, and her tongue had gone numb for 20 minutes. Foxglove extract, slow, untraceable in an infant's system unless someone was specifically looking. The pack physician was not looking because the pack physician answered to Durst, and Durst wanted the heir dead. Noah was the last son of Alpha Callum Greymarch, who had died in a border skirmish 3 months ago under circumstances that Durst's war council called tragic and unavoidable, and that Tavi, who had served their drinks that night and heard their low voices afterward, called orchestrated. Callum's Luna, a quiet woman named Rowena, who had smiled at Tavi once in the kitchen hallway, the only person in the pack who had ever looked at her face instead of through it, had died in childbirth. The physician had arrived late, Durst's physician, Durst's timing, and now Durst was regent, and Durst's mate Ismay was wearing Rowena's jewelry and sleeping in Rowena's bedroom and slowly poisoning Rowena's son in a nursery that smelled like lavender and foxglove and careful patient murder. Tavi had stolen the last 3 clean bottles, dumped them, mixed fresh formula from the dry stores in the kitchen, fed Noah herself in the dark of the scullery at 2 in the morning, and then she had wrapped him against her body and walked out the service entrance that no one ever locked because no one ever thought the kitchen girl was worth watching. She was 24. She had no wolf. At 12, when every pup in her cohort had stood beneath the autumn moon and shifted for the first time, Tavi had stood in the circle and felt nothing, not even a flicker. The pack had watched with the particular discomfort of people witnessing something embarrassing that they would later pretend hadn't happened. They called her husk after that, as in dried out, as in whatever was supposed to be inside had never grown. She had no family. Her mother had died when Tavi was 6, a fever that took her in 3 days and left Tavi with a box of belongings that fit under a cot, a wooden comb, a pressed flower in wax paper, and a leather cord with a small iron pendant shaped like a drop of water. Her mother had worn it always. Tavi wore it now against her sternum, where it pressed cold between her skin and Noah's cheek. Her father was a name her mother never spoke, a wolf who had passed through Greymarch territory in winter and left before the snow melted, leaving behind a pregnant woman and nothing else. No photograph, no letter. Just the pendant and a story Tavi's mother had told once in the last hours of the fever. Delirious and gripping Tavi's small hand, he sang to the wounded and they healed. He bled into the river and the fish came back to life. He was the last one and they were hunting him and I told him to run. Tavi had been 6. She had not understood. She had filed it away in the place where children store things that are too large to hold, and she had not taken it out again, because when your days consist of scrubbing grease and avoiding backhand from the head cook, the mysteries of dead parents are not a priority. The creek bed ended at a ridge. Beyond it the tree line changed. Greymarch's forests were birch and poplar, pale and sparse. The trees ahead were black spruce, dense and ancient, their branches interlocked overhead like the ribs of a cathedral. Ironmoor territory. The air smelled different here. Colder, metallic, like the taste of a copper coin held under the tongue. She climbed the ridge on her hands and knees because her feet had stopped being reliable. The rocks tore her palms. She didn't feel it. She had stopped feeling anything below her wrists 20 minutes ago. And that was fine. That was a problem for later, because Noah's breathing had changed. Shorter. Shallower. Gaps between the inhales that lasted long enough for her to count to 3. The poison was in his blood. She had stopped the source, but the damage was already circulating, and she was not a healer. She was a kitchen girl with split boots and bleeding hands, carrying a dying baby into enemy territory, because the only healer she had ever heard of, who specialized in infant poisoning cases, was a woman named Brigid, who worked in the Ironmoor medical wing, and who had published a paper, actual medical paper, on neonatal toxin recovery that Tavi had found in a water-damaged journal in the Greymarch library 3 years ago, while shelving books for the librarian who had a bad hip. 3 years ago. She had read that paper and thought, abstractly, the way you think about things that will never apply to your life, that someone who could do that kind of work must be extraordinary. And now she was betting a 5-week-old baby's life on a journal article and a 30-kilometre walk through frozen territory, and the hope that Ironmoor wolves would listen before they killed her. The patrol station appeared through the trees like a hallucination. Stone walls, wooden roof, smoke from a chimney, a carved post out front bearing the Ironmoor sigil, a wolf's head in profile, jaws open wreathed in thorns. She tried to stand, her knees gave. She caught herself on a spruce trunk, the bark rough and cold through her ruined gloves, and she hauled herself upright and adjusted the sling to make sure Noah's face was clear, that air was reaching him, that the small bluish tinge around his lips was a trick of moonlight and not what she knew it was. She made it to the door. She knocked. The sound was nothing. Fingernails on wood. She tried again, harder, and the door opened, and the wolf who stood there was built like a shipping container, broad and square with a shaved head and a beard that looked like it had been grown for insulation rather than style. He wore the Ironmoor patrol blacks, and he looked at Tavi the way a man looks at something the wind blew onto his doorstep. "The hell did you come from?" "Greymarch." Her voice was a scrape, a match struck on wet stone. "The creek bed, please. He needs a healer." She pulled the sling open. Noah's face in the light from inside the station was grey-blue, slack, his breathing barely visible. "He's 5 weeks old, he's been poisoned. Foxglove in his formula, 9 days' worth, please. Your healer, Brigid." She wrote a paper on neonatal toxin recovery. She's the only one who might. The patrol wolf, whose name was Oswin, was no longer looking at Tavi. He was looking at the infant with an expression she recognized because she had seen it on the faces of Greymarch wolves when the alpha's pup was presented at the naming ceremony. Horror, specific, focused horror at the sight of a baby in distress. "Inside," he said. "Now." She stepped over the threshold and the warmth hit her like a wall, and her body, which had been operating on adrenaline and terror, and the particular stubbornness of a woman who had spent 18 years being told she was nothing, and had decided tonight that she was not, simply quit, her legs folded. Oswin caught her with one arm, enormous and surprisingly careful, and lowered her into a chair by the fire. "Sawyer, radio the main house. Tell Brigid we have a poisoned infant 5 weeks, foxglove ingestion 9 days exposure. Tell her to bring the neonatal kit. A younger wolf at a desk scrambled for the radio equipment. And tell the alpha. The younger wolf hesitated. It's 3:30 in the morning. Tell the alpha. The radio crackled. Words were exchanged. Tavi drank the water someone put in her hands and felt it burn down her throat like ice and whiskey combined. And it was the cleanest thing she had ever tasted, and she wanted to cry, and she did not cry. Because she had stopped crying at 11 years old when the head cook had beaten her with a ladle for burning the porridge, and she had decided then that tears were a currency she could not afford to spend. Noah made a sound, thin, reedy, the mewl of something too small and too weak to scream. His heartbeats thready, Oswin said. He had the baby now pressed against his broad chest, 2 fingers monitoring the pulse at Noah's tiny neck. Brigid's 15 minutes out. The alpha is 5 minutes out, Sawyer said from the radio. He was running the North Ridge. He heard the transmission. He's coming in wolf form. The fire dimmed. That was what Tavi noticed first. Not a draft, not a gust from the door. The flames themselves pulled inward, contracting, as if the fire was trying to make itself smaller. The temperature in the room dropped 3 degrees in the space of a breath, and every wolf in the station went rigid in the particular way of animals who have sensed something larger enter their territory. The door opened. He filled the frame the way weather fills a valley. Not just tall, though he was taller than any man she had seen, well over 6 feet, with the kind of breadth that suggested his skeleton had been designed for a slightly larger species. Not just broad. Present, the room reorganized itself around him. The air thickened. Gravity had an opinion. Beckett Ironmoor was still in the process of shifting back. She could see it in the way his muscles moved beneath his shirt, which he'd apparently pulled on somewhere between wolf form and the door, unbuttoned, hanging open over a chest that was more scar tissue than skin. His hair was dark, cropped close, wet with snow. His jaw was the architectural element that held his entire face together, sharp and set and carrying the of a man who had been running full speed through a frozen forest because he'd heard the word poisoned on a radio frequency. His eyes were grey. Not blue-grey, not steel-grey. The grey of lake ice in January, pale and deep and absolutely still. They were looking at her. He stopped moving. The cessation was total, a mechanical shutdown, every part of him going silent at once. His nostrils flared, his pupils blew wide, the grey irises thinning to slivers. His hands closed into fists at his sides. She heard his knuckles crack from across the room. "Mate," he said. The word was not spoken. It was extracted, pulled from somewhere below his voice, below his chest, from the place where the wolf lived and the man visited. It vibrated through the stone floor and up through the legs of Tavi's chair and into her spine. She stared at him. "What? You are my mate?" His voice had fracture lines. She could hear them, the places where control was holding by threads. "I can feel it, my wolf. That's not possible. I don't have a wolf." He crossed the room in 3 strides and she flinched hard, a full-body recoil that she hated herself for because it was involuntary and it told him everything, and he stopped dead. Mid-step, his body locked in place with a control that must have cost him something physical because she could see the tremor running through his arms. "You flinched," he said. "Quiet. Clinical. The tone of a man cataloguing damage. Who did that to you?" She did not answer. She was looking at his hands. They were shaking. The most feared alpha on the continent, the Iron Wolf, the man whose name was used to frighten children in packs he'd never visited, was shaking because she had pulled away from him. "The baby," she said, because Noah was the only thing. "Please, he's been poisoned. Foxglove in his milk for 9 days. He's the heir of Greymarch, Callum's son, and the regent's mate has been killing him slowly, and no one is coming for him because no one cares. Your healer, Brigid." Beckett turned his head toward Oswin. The motion was stiff, mechanical, as if looking away from Tavi required a physical override. "Give me the child." Oswin handed Noah over. The alpha took the infant in scarred hands that suddenly moved with surgical gentleness. He cradled the small body against the crook of his arm, pressed his thumb to the fontanelle, felt the pulse at the neck. His heartbeat is erratic. Breathing is depressed. Brigid, 15 minutes, Alpha. 7, tell her 7. Tell her I don't care if she has to sprout wings. Sawyer hit the radio again. Beckett looked back at Tavi. His eyes moved over her and she knew what he was seeing. The same thing she saw every morning in the cracked mirror above the kitchen sink. The burns on her forearms from years of reaching into ovens and catching splatter from pots. The thinness, the particular gauntness of a person who prepares food for others and eats whatever is left, which is never enough. The bruises on her wrists from the head cook's grip when she moved too slowly. The split boots. The blood on her hands from the creek-bed rocks. Something in his face changed. The grey of his eyes darkened, not to black, but to something older. The colour of storm clouds before lightning. His lips pulled back, and she saw his canines, longer than they should have been, the wolf pushing against the human architecture. "Who?" he said, and the word was barely a word, more a vibration, a frequency that made the windows rattle. "Did this to you? It doesn't matter. It is the only thing that matters. No, Noah is the only thing that matters. I didn't walk 30 kilometres for myself. I came because he was dying and no one was going to stop it. If your healer can save him, I'll go. I'll go back. I'll face whatever. You are not going back. You don't get to decide that." The silence in the station was the kind that has weight. Oswin had stopped breathing. Sawyer's hand floated above the radio. The fire, already diminished, barely flickered. Beckett's jaw worked. She watched the muscles shift beneath the skin. The visible effort of a man who commanded an army, who had killed with his bare hands, who could end her with a thought, forcing himself to speak carefully to a woman who weighed 110 pounds and had walked here on bleeding feet. "You're right," he said. "I don't, but I am asking." Something moved inside Tavi, deep. In the hollow place below her sternum where her wolf should have lived and never had, something shifted. Not a thought, a sensation, like a creature uncurling from a very long sleep. She put her hand over her chest, confused. "I don't understand what's happening." "Yes," he said. "You do." Brigid arrived in 11 minutes. Not 7, and she was not what Tavi had imagined. The legendary healer was 63, wiry, with close-cropped grey hair and wire-rimmed glasses and a canvas field bag that she carried like a weapon. She was wearing pajama pants and an Ironmoor medical jacket thrown over top, and she looked at Beckett with the expression of a woman who had known him since he was born and was not impressed. This had better be. She stopped. Her eyes found Noah. The professional assessment took approximately 4 seconds. "Bring them both. Healing room, now." The next hour collapsed into fragments. Warm light, clean surfaces. Brigid's hands, quick and precise, unwrapping the baby, examining him, muttering terminology that Tavi mostly understood because she had read that journal article 7 times. Blood work. IV access on a vein so small it shouldn't have been possible. A syringe of something clear pushed into Noah's thigh while the baby screamed, and Tavi gripped the edge of her cot hard enough to turn her knuckles white. "Activated charcoal compound modified for neonatal metabolism," Brigid said, without looking up. "Chelation protocol for cardiac glycoside accumulation. This child has been receiving sub-lethal doses for over a week. Another 3 days and we'd be looking at permanent cardiac damage." She glanced at Beckett, who stood in the doorway, filling it, his face carved from the same stone as the walls. "Someone did this deliberately. The dosing is precise, enough to weaken, not enough to kill quickly. Whoever prepared this wanted it to look like failure to thrive." The sound Beckett made was geological, low, sustained, emanating from somewhere in his ribcage that was not designed for human speech. Within 40 minutes, Noah was drinking from a bottle that Brigid had prepared with a formula that smelled like warm milk and activated charcoal and something faintly herbal, and his color was changing. The blue-gray fading, pink surfacing like dawn coming up over snow. His eyes focused. His small fists closed around the bottle with the furious grip of an infant who understood on some cellular level that sustenance was not guaranteed. Tavi cried. The tears came without permission. Not sobs, not sounds, just water running silently down her face while she watched a 5-week-old baby eat. She had not cried since she was 11. Not when the cook broke her wrist for dropping a serving bowl. Not when the pack held a second shifting ceremony for her at 14. A mercy attempt that had only produced a longer, more public humiliation. Not once in 24 years of kitchen floors and burns, and the word husk following her through hallways like a smell. But watching Noah drink, watching his tiny hands grip, watching his chest rise and fall with the steady rhythm of a body remembering how to be alive, she broke. Beckett crossed the room. He sat on the edge of the cot beside her. He did not touch her. He sat there, a wall of warmth and iron and the faint smell of snow and spruce resin, and he waited. She leaned sideways. Her shoulder touched his arm. He went completely still and let her stay. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me. You carried him here. You walked 30 kilometers on feet that are going to need reconstructive work according to the look Bridget just gave me. You figured out the foxglove. You did all of it, duh. I read a journal article. You read a journal article and then you saved a child's life with it. That is not nothing," she wanted to argue. She had been arguing with kindness for 24 years because kindness in Greymarch had always preceded demands. Bridget finished with Noah, settled him in a heated bassinet with monitors and warming pads, and turned to Tavi with the expression of a woman who had been practicing medicine for 4 decades and could still be freshly appalled. "Shirt off. I'm fine. You have 2nd-degree frostbite on 6 toes, lacerations on both palms, 2 fractured metatarsals, and you're running a temperature of 39.4. You have not been fine in some time. Shirt off, or I sedate you and cut it off." Tavi took off the shirt. The room went still. The burns and bruises were their own map. Years of kitchen work layered over years of casual violence, the kind that doesn't aim because it doesn't need to, because the target has been designated as something that can absorb impact without consequence. But beneath all of it, across her shoulder blades and down her spine, something else. Marks, not burns, not bruises, lines. Thin, deliberate, carved into her skin in a pattern that Tavi had never seen clearly because they were on her back, and she had no one to ask, and she had assumed, since childhood, that they were scars from the fever that had killed her mother. Bridget put down her instruments. She put on her glasses. She walked behind Tavi and looked at the marks for a long time. "Beckett," she said, and her voice was stripped of its briskness. "Come see this." He came around. Tavi heard his breathing stop. "What?" she said. "What is it?" "These aren't fever scars," Bridget said. "These are binding sigils, old magic, blood magic. Someone carved a suppression array into your spine when you were a child. An infant, probably. The scarring suggests the skin was still forming, a suppression. Someone sealed your wolf, deliberately, permanently. This is why you never shifted. This is why they called you Husk. There is nothing empty about you. Something was locked inside you before you were old enough to remember." The pendant against Tavi's chest, her mother's pendant, the iron teardrop, suddenly felt warm. Not hot, warm, like a hand pressing against skin. "Who would do that?" she whispered. "Someone who knew what you carried," Beckett said. His voice was barely controlled. "Someone who wanted to make sure you never found out what you are, what I am. I'm a kitchen girl. I'm a husk. You are not a husk." Bridget had pulled a book from a shelf, old, hand-bound. She opened it to a page with an illustration that matched the pattern on Tavi's back, line for line. This binding array was designed for a specific purpose. It was created 300 years ago to contain wolves of the Bloodsinger line. Silence. Bloodsinger wolves were healers, Bridget said. The original healers. Their blood carried regenerative properties. They could sing a wound closed. They could bleed into water and purify it. The line was hunted to extinction 60 years ago by the Council of Elders, who considered them a threat to the natural order. She paused. "Or so we believed. My mother said my father healed things," Tavi whispered. She said he bled into the river and the fish came back. Brigid took Tavi's hand, turned it over. pressed her thumb against the inside of Tavi's wrist where, beneath the skin, a vein pulsed with a faintly luminous quality that Tavi had noticed her entire life and assumed was normal. "That is not normal vasculature," Brigid said quietly. "That is bloodsinger marrow. It doesn't change anything," Beckett said. "It changes everything," Brigid corrected. "It changes nothing about what she is to me. I felt the bond before I knew any of this. I would have felt it if she were exactly what they called her. The bloodline is a fact. It is not a reason." The words settled over Tavi like something warm. She examined them from every angle, looking for the hook, the cost, the transaction she would eventually be expected to pay. She found nothing. Just a man looking at her as if she were the answer to a question he had been asking for 33 years. The delegation from Greymarch arrived on the third day. 3 wolves, Durst, lean and sharp-eyed, wearing the regent's chain that had belonged to Callum. Ismay, in a fur-trimmed cloak that Tavi recognized as Rowena's. And a third figure, elderly, stooped, whom Tavi recognized with a shock that buckled her knees, Morna, the pack's eldest counsellor. The woman who had presided over Tavi's failed shifting ceremony. The woman who had been first to use the word husk. Beckett received them in the great hall, seated on the Ironmoor throne, black wood carved with thorns, with the posture of something that did not need to prove it was dangerous. Durst spoke first, smooth, rehearsed, a regrettable misunderstanding, a disturbed omega, a stolen heir. The child should be returned for his own safety. Beckett let the silence stretch until Durst's left hand began to twitch. "The child you describe," Beckett said conversationally, "was found with foxglove metabolites in his bloodstream at levels consistent with 9 days of deliberate poisoning. My healer has documented the dosing pattern. It is precise. It is intentional. It is attempted murder." Durst's polished facade cracked at the edges. Ismay touched his arm. "Alpha, the girl is unstable." "A wolfless kitchen servant with a history of—" "The girl," Beckett said, and the temperature in the hall dropped so sharply that Tavi, watching from a servant's corridor above, saw Durst physically lean away from the throne, "has a name, and she is my mate." The silence that followed had density. Mass. You could have leaned against it. "With respect," Durst recovered, "the girl is wolfless, a mating bond with an alpha of your—" "Thank you for explaining my own bond to me, Regent." Beckett stood. The slowness of it was the terrifying part, because it gave everyone in the hall time to register his full height, the breadth of him, the way the light caught the scars on his hands. "Here is what will happen. The child remains under Ironmoor protection. Tavi remains here. If Callum's heir is to be discussed, send someone who did not orchestrate his murder." Morna spoke then. Her voice was dry paper, old wood, the sound of a woman who had carried something heavy for a very long time. "Alpha Ironmoor, may I speak?" He inclined his head. The girl's father was Jorin Bloodsinger, the last of the line. He passed through Greymarch 25 years ago, hunted by the council. I was the one who carved the binding sigils when the child was 9 months old. A Bloodsinger wolf in Greymarch would have drawn the council to our borders. They would have raised the pack to reach her. I did what I believed was necessary. You mutilated an infant. I saved 1,000 wolves by destroying one. Morna's face did something unexpected. It broke. For a single breath, the hardness fractured and Tavi saw grief underneath, old and compressed, the kind that becomes structural part of the skeleton. "I visited her mother," Morna said softly, "every week until the fever took her. I brought medicine. I argued against putting the child in the kitchens. I could not undo what I had done without risking everything, but I tried." She pressed her lips together. The moment sealed over. "If you remove the binding, you release a wolf that has been caged for 24 years. A Bloodsinger wolf. The council will hear of it. Let them hear. You do not understand what you are inviting. I understand exactly what I am inviting. I am inviting them to come to my territory and explain to me why a bloodline of healers was hunted to extinction. I look forward to the conversation." They left. Morna paused at the threshold and said, without looking up at the corridor where she clearly knew Tavi was listening, The sigils will burn when they break. That is the wolf coming through. Do not fight her. The unbinding happened at dawn. Bridget laid out her instruments on a white cloth beside the cot, with the quiet focus of a surgeon preparing for something she had only read about. 7 sigils, each one carved into the spine, each one a lock on a door that had been closed for 24 years. Beckett sat beside the cot, close enough to touch. Not touching, because he never did, not until she reached first. She had learned this about him in 3 days, that he would stand in fire for her and never close the distance by a centimetre unless she asked. She reached out, took his hand. "Stay," she said. "I am not going anywhere." Bridget began. The first sigil broke like a bone snapping inside her chest. White heat. A wire pulled through her spine from tailbone to skull. Tavi gripped Beckett's hand and did not scream, because she had been trained not to scream, because years of burns and bruises had taught her to swallow sound and store it somewhere deep where it calcified into something harder than pain. "Breathe," Brigid said. The second. The third. Each one worse, because each one released more of the wolf, and the wolf was not sleeping anymore. She was awake, she was furious. 24 years of imprisonment, and she was coming through the walls with a rage that was almost beautiful in its purity. The fourth sigil broke and Tavi screamed. The sound was not entirely human. It came from her throat and from somewhere beneath her throat, and the glass in every window of the healing room fractured simultaneously, not shattering, webbing, fine lines spreading outward like frost on a lake. "Sit down," Brigid snapped at Beckett, who was on his feet. "She is doing exactly what she's supposed to do." Fifth. Sixth. Tavi's vision went red, then gold, then a color she had no name for, a color that existed only in the space between what she had been and what she was becoming. She could feel her bones remembering, her skin remembering. Her blood was singing. She could hear it, a frequency beneath sound, beneath vibration, a hum that was cellular and ancient and hers. "Last one," Brigid said from very far away. "This is the primary seal. When it breaks, your wolf comes through. Don't fight her." The 7th sigil shattered. Tavi came apart and reassembled, not painfully, with a terrible, perfect rightness, like a word you've been trying to remember for 20 years finally arriving on your tongue. Her spine elongated, her hands changed, her senses detonated outward. She could hear Beckett's heartbeat fast and hard, could smell the herbs in Brigid's kit, the snow on the mountains, the deer in the forest 4 kilometres away, the salt of tears on someone's face. Her own, Beckett's. She landed on 4 paws. The cot was beneath her, broken. She was large, much larger than a kitchen girl's wolf should have been. Her fur was the color of dark copper, deep red gold, like embers in the last light before they go white. And when she turned her head, she caught her reflection in the cracked window, eyes the color of heated iron, luminous, alive. Something fell from her chest as she shifted, the iron pendant. It hit the floor and rang like a bell, a single clear note that resonated through the stone walls and did not stop. Brigid sat down heavily. "Bloodsinger," she whispered. "A true bloodsinger wolf. I read about them my entire career. I never thought I'd see one." Tavi shifted back. It happened as naturally as breathing, like stepping through a doorway she had always known was there. She knelt on the cracked floor, shaking, her back smooth and unscarred. The binding marks were gone. Beckett pulled off his jacket and wrapped it around her. It hung to her knees. It smelled like him, spruce resin and iron and cold air, and she pulled it close and breathed. "Don't," she said quietly. "Don't what? Don't want me because I'm useful, because my blood can do things." He looked at her, and for the first time she saw anger directed at her, not violence. A clean, sharp anger that had edges. "I wanted you when you were a kitchen girl with burned hands and split boots. I wanted you when you smelled like creek water and blood and foxglove. My wolf knew you before either of us knew what you were. The bloodline is a fact. It is not a reason." She believed him. Not because the words were beautiful, though they were in their blunt and graceless way. Because she could feel him through the bond, fully open now. And there was no deception, just certainty, Just a man who had waited 33 years and would wait 33 more if she needed him to. She did not need him to. "Then stop waiting," she said. "I'm here." He pulled her in, not rough, not sudden, inevitable, the way rivers find the ocean. His arms closed around her, careful of the bruises, careful of everything, and she pressed her face against his chest and felt, for the first time in 24 years, the walls she had built to survive begin to dissolve. Not collapse. Dissolve. Slowly, like ice in spring. They held the ceremony under the full moon in the great hall with the skylight open to the winter sky. 2,000 wolves filled the hall and the courtyard beyond. Oswin stood at the front in dress uniform, looking profoundly uncomfortable. Bridget sat to the side with Noah on her lap, because she had declared herself the child's medical guardian, and no one, including the Alpha, had contested this. Tavi wore dark red, a dress that Bridget had produced from somewhere, simple, fitted, the color of her wolf's coat. The iron pendant hung at her throat, polished, warm. The mark on her wrist, the faint luminescence beneath the skin, caught the moonlight and glowed. Beckett stood at the front of the hall in black formal wear, the scars on his hands visible, the scars on his chest hidden, and he watched her walk toward him, and his face broke open. The control fell away. The Alpha mask, the Iron Wolf composure, the King's architecture, all of it crumbled, and underneath was something raw and terrified and entirely human. She reached him. She took his hand. "I'm here," she said. He said the old words. The formal mating vows, spoken in the ancient tongue, in a voice that did not waver, looking at her the way a man looks at the first warm day after a winter that lasted his entire life. Then the marking. He tilted her head, exposing the curve of her neck, and she felt his breath first, warm, then his lips, gentle, then the bite. Sharp, bright, a pain that was not pain but a key turning in a lock, and the bond between them, which had been a hum and then a roar, became something structural, foundational, part of the architecture of who she was. She marked him back. Bloodsinger wolves had their own traditions. When her teeth broke the skin of his neck, she felt him shudder, felt his hands tighten on her waist, heard that sound from his throat, low, involuntary. And 2,000 wolves heard it too, and she did not care. The hall erupted in howls, deep, resonant, the sound of a pack acknowledging its Luna. The sound vibrated through the stone, through the floor, through her bones. Noah, in Brigid's arms, began to cry, and then to laugh, the bewildered sound of an infant overwhelmed by volume, and Brigid bounced him with the practiced ease of a woman who had been delivering babies for 4 decades. Later, much later, after the hall had emptied and the fires had burned low and the snow had begun to fall again, Tavi sat on the floor of their quarters with Noah in her lap. The boy was gnawing on a carved wooden wolf that Oswin had made himself, sanded, smooth, the teeth carefully rounded. Beckett sat across from her, his back against the bed, legs stretched out, the marking bite on his neck, still vivid. "Callum's sister agreed to the custody arrangement," he said. "She'll visit twice a year." She asked if Noah was happy. "What did you say?" "I said the child is being raised by a woman who walked 30 kilometres through a frozen creek bed to save him, and that he is the most aggressively well-fed infant in the Northern Territories." Noah chose this moment to throw the carved wolf at Beckett's chest. It bounced off his sternum. The Alpha King of Ironmoor looked down at it, picked it up, and handed it back. "Good arm," he said. Tavi laughed. It came out rusty and unpracticed, a sound she barely recognized as her own, and Beckett's head turned, and she saw the look on his face. The way his eyes widened, the way his lips parted, and she understood that he intended to spend the rest of his life making that sound happen as often as possible. She looked at the fire, at Noah's small hands gripping the wooden wolf, at Beckett's face in the warm light. The scars softened, the grey eyes half closed, watching her the way he always watched her, as if she might disappear and he needed to memorize her before she did. "I want to go back to Greymarch," she said. He tensed. "Not to stay. I want to see Morna. She carved those sigils into an infant, and she brought medicine to my mother every week until she died. I need to understand how both of those things live inside the same person." He was quiet for a moment, Then I'll come with you. You don't have to. I know. I want to. She leaned against his outstretched leg. His hand came up and rested on her head, fingers threading through her hair, and Noah crawled into the space between them and fell asleep there, warm, safe, the small weight of him pressing against both their legs like an anchor. Outside the window, the moon was setting behind the mountains. The last of its light caught the iron pendant at Tavi's throat, and for a moment, just a moment, it glowed, not bright, not dramatic. A small, steady pulse, like a heartbeat, like a promise, like a door that had been sealed for 24 years finally standing open.